Queen Elizabeth died with no children, and because of the marriage long before of Henry VIII's sister to the King of Scotland, the nearest relative was James I. And he became the king. He'd already been the king. He was already the king of Scotland. He was James VI, the sixth James of Scotland. He was the first James of England. Now, if we just look at it, Henry VII, with his two children here, and Margaret Tudor is his daughter, the sister of Henry VIII, and marries the King of Scotland, who is James IV. James IV then has his son, James V, who marries and has, as a child, only a daughter, Mary, Queen of Scots, the one that we had all that exciting story about together with Queen Elizabeth, the one who had the sort of extraordinary life. You may especially remember that she was accused of marrying the man who probably murdered her previous husband. So that's Mary, and James is her son. So it's one of those. Yep. Would you like your firstly? I'll give you a print, and then you can collect your other bits and pieces if you need to later on. So it's one of those cases where the English are saying to James, what kind of sorry about this, because we did chop your mum's head off. Would you do us a favour and come and be our king? And James says, well, Betsy, I don't really care about my mum. I never knew her anyway. She abandoned me when I was tiny. I never knew her. And yeah, sure, I'll be the King of England. So James comes down from Scotland to be the King of England. So basically, it's the great grandson of Henry VII's daughter, who now becomes the King of England. Kokusai Kekkon, international marriage, was one of the sort of high-class things that happened. If you were from a royal family and you're a prince, you have to marry a princess. Or if you're a princess, you have to marry a prince. Well, where are you going to find them? Okay, you can't marry your own brothers and sisters inside your own royal family, so you marry outside that royal family. Or else you marry a local girl or a local boy and raise him up. So these kinds of international marriages were very useful in those days because they would bring countries together. Scotland had been an enemy of England for hundreds of years. And this marriage actually brought, during the 16th century, started to bring Scotland and England a little bit closer together. The other way of countries interacting was through war. Countries would control each other by fighting. Marriage was very often a better solution. They could just marry and countries could come close together without having to fight. So when Elizabeth died with no children in 1603, the Scottish king became the King of England. And England and Wales were already united at this time, and since 1542, the ruler of England, who at that time was Henry VIII, had also claimed to be the ruler of Ireland. So we're beginning to get something that's looking more like the United Kingdom, but it's not united yet. The only two countries that can be said to be united here are Wales and England. Scotland doesn't technically become united until the 18th century, the beginning of the 18th century, and Ireland not until later again, in 1800. So 1707, Scotland formally unites with England, and 1800 or 1801, Ireland becomes part of the United Kingdom. But once James becomes the king, these countries are now very closely linked, particularly Scotland and England, which have been enemies for quite a long time, are now much more closely linked. So the first question that comes up is, of course, religion. Scotland by now was a Protestant country, so James was coming from a Protestant tradition, but Scottish Protestantism was a little bit different from English Protestantism. They were usually Presbyterian Protestants. There are so many different kinds of Protestant, if you remember. He wasn't an Kyokai Protestant originally, but he became the head of the church. So his attitude towards religion is going to be important here. One particular thing that he believed was that the reason he was king was because God had chosen him to be king. This is called the divine right. Divine means from God, and the right came from God for him to be king. This meant that basically he was going to be pretty stubborn, ganko. Why should I listen to other people's advice? God wants me to be king. I can do what I want. I'm here because God's chosen me. So he had that sort of confidence that he didn't need to listen to other people, and this caused a certain amount of trouble. The Bible had already, of course, been translated into English, but King James ordered a particular translation, a special translation. He felt that not enough energy had gone into making a perfect translation. And the authorized version of the Bible, which was published in 1611, remained the standard version of the Bible for hundreds of years. Even when I was a little boy, they were still using the authorized version in the schools and in the churches. Then they moved on to something called the New English Bible, which is not so good. Why not? Because Shakespeare's English, the English of this period, is so beautiful. It's a kind of organgidai of the English language. And that's one of the reasons why Shakespeare is so great, because he's writing in a wonderful style of English. And the Bible is in that same style, the authorized version. So it's very beautiful. It's a very poetic translation. The New English Bible, I think a lot of people like me were disappointed when they changed to the New English Bible. It's more modern, but it's much less poetic. So anyway, James created this authorized version of the Bible. Authorized means that it doesn't mean he was the author. It means that he gave permission. He gave the authority for the translation to happen. So a whole team of people worked on translating it, and he had given them special permission or a special order to translate the Bible. Catholics had been hoping for quite a lot from James because traditionally the Stuart family had quite a lot of Catholic connections, and we'll see that those Catholic connections could be a problem later on in the century. So Catholics had been hoping that James would give them greater freedom, but he didn't. He became king, and Catholics had perhaps even a worse time of it with James than they'd had with Elizabeth. So something happened in 1605 called the Gunpowder Plot, and we'll talk about that later on in today's class. I'll give you a little dictation later on the Gunpowder Plot. And this is also true of the Puritans. They'd been hoping for greater acceptance, and they were also going to be disappointed. James was interested in carrying on pretty much the way Elizabeth had with this middle way, but he was making the middle way a little bit narrower than it had been, so that people who were outside it on the Catholic side, people who were outside it on the very strong Protestant side, the Puritan side, they felt maybe less satisfied than they had felt under Elizabeth. So he was, he took it very seriously that he was head of the church, and he was rather strict. He was a scholar, a serious scholar. He published several books. He published, that's rather coming in rather quickly there, yeah, half a dozen books or so on a wide range of different topics. One of them, as you can see here, is on tobacco. He was very against tobacco. He published a counterblast to tobacco. Some of them are political, some of them are religious. I'm going to focus on one of them in particular, and it's on demonology, that is, on witches. Let's just take a look at that. It's at the back at the moment. I'm going to bring it out here. Let's have a look at it. That one. Yeah. All right. Demonology in form of a dialogue written by the high and mighty Prince James. And demonology, a demon is just another word for akuma. Demonology, I don't think you've got a word for ology. Ology means like the study of or the science of devils. I don't think there's a word in Japanese for that. So basically, this is a book about witchcraft. James believed in witches. So he thought there really were people who worshipped the devil, people who could cast magic and spells, and it came from the devil. It was evil. A lot of people in those days believed this kind of thing, and James was one of them. He strongly believed it, and he published this book to express his belief in witches. Now, Scotland was especially strict in this respect. At least something around 5,000, between 4,000 and 6,000 people were put to death as witches in Scotland, compared with about 1,000 in England. The population of Scotland is smaller than the population of England, so really per head of the population about 10 times as many people were burned. Sorry, they weren't burned. I don't think they were burned in Scotland either. In England, they certainly weren't burned. They were hanged. I'm not sure, actually, if they were burned or hanged, but anyway, they were put to death in Scotland in large numbers, and superstition, belief in witches was high in Scotland at that time. Which leads us to a little bit of Shakespeare, because Shakespeare wrote a play to welcome the new king. The play was a play that included witches. Any idea? Does anybody know a Shakespeare play that includes witches? You're not literature students, so I don't necessarily expect you to know the answer. Does anybody know? Nobody's going to take a risk. Okay, well, you might be thinking of something. Let's see, as you can see if you're right. One of the most famous scenes in Shakespeare is the three witches in Macbeth. And Macbeth was a real historical figure. He was a king in Scotland in the Middle Ages, and Shakespeare wrote his play following a historical account in Hollingshead's Chronicles. I think I mentioned Hollingshead last week when I talked about the different writings and culture of the Elizabethan period. Hollingshead was a historian of the period. Shakespeare often used him to get information for his plays. But in Hollingshead's account, there are no witches. So how did the witches come into Macbeth? Well, basically because Shakespeare was writing this play to entertain the new king. He wanted to keep the new king happy. He thought, oh, the new king is interested in witches. The new king wrote a book about witches. Let's put some witches into my play. So he invented the idea of the witches in Macbeth. They're not there, of course, in the history, but Shakespeare put them in because he wanted to please James. Now, this whole belief in witches, we have talked a little bit about it. Let's just take a look at this belief in witches at that time. It was possible for a man to be accused of being a witch, although strictly speaking, a witch is a woman. But we don't have a good word for a man who's a witch. A wizard is a little bit different. But anyway, they would accuse them of the crime. It was very typical in those days. Rather than saying, you are a witch, they would say, you are guilty of the crime of witchcraft. The same thing would go with, well, for example, homosexuality was illegal. They wouldn't say, you are gay. They would say, you did something that's homosexual. See what I mean? It would be the crime rather than the person. They wouldn't be pointing a finger at a particular person and saying something about that person. They'd be accusing them of an activity. So rather than that's your identity, you did that action. So that was the way they tended to think about things like witchcraft or a lot of things. If you look at their legal system, it was you did that action, not you are that kind of person. Okay, so if you kill somebody, they wouldn't say so much you are a murderer as you did that thing, you killed somebody. Right? So it's a little bit different from modern thinking, because somebody kills somebody, say you are a murderer, okay, or that kind of thing. In their way of thinking, if you do that action, it's that action that they're interested in. The action of murder, the action of doing some kind of major kind of thing, that sort of way of expressing themselves. So, okay then, why were women so often accused of being witches? It goes back basically to the Bible and the Garden of Eden, where Eve is the one who takes the apple from the snake. You probably know this story, or you've got some idea of this story of Eve, the first woman, being tempted by a snake in the Garden of Eden, and that she eats the forbidden fruit, and she gives it to Adam to eat. So the idea that Ijiwaru comes in through the woman, evil comes in through the woman, was a typical idea in the early modern period. Yeah. Are we okay? People still putting one or two things in on the print. All right. So because of this story, women in the early modern period were often considered to be naturally more evil than men. That was partly because of the Bible. And indeed, Christianity in the Middle Ages had been guilty of blowing up this crime of witchcraft and pointing the finger especially at women. There were several books published, and some of the Romaho, some of the popes were very strong in accusing women of being witches. So partly the belief in witches came from the Bible and Christianity. Now, witchcraft is mostly connected with women, and James himself was probably gay, or if not gay, he was bisexual, or and we tend to see the witch hunts as a form of hatred of women, because mostly they were directed against women. Okay, so we don't know if James had that sort of hatred of women, but he's mostly thought by historians to have been probably gay and at least bisexual. I mean, he did marry, he did have 3 children. And again, that's a little bit of a difference between modern thinking and thinking in those days. The idea that if he's gay, how could he marry? Because he's done that action that's not gay. But you'd have to study the psychology of all of this, all right? Sexuality and so on. He certainly had a number of very close friendships with men. And this was his wife. Queen of Anne of Denmark. Here she is a couple of years after he became King of England. But after Elizabeth had been Queen and James came in as King, this little Latin saying came up. Rex fuit Elizabeth. Elizabeth was King. She was a danse tekina, queen. Nunc est regina Jacobus. Now, James, Jacobus is the Latin for James, is our queen. So he's a Jose tekina danse. So Elizabeth was a very masculine kind of queen, and James was a very kind of feminine kind of king. So this was a Latin epigram that became famous at that time, that Elizabeth was the king and James is the queen. Of course, in modern English, we do use the word queen to mean gay, but in those days, sono imi wa nakatta. Queen didn't mean gay. It's just a kind of coincidence. So let's go a little bit into the political aspect of James as king, his international relations, the way he connected with other countries, and how England became, started along its road towards becoming an internationally important country. Now, Elizabeth had already scored a big victory by beating the Spanish Armada. James was pretty good, really, in keeping England away from war. He avoided a very complicated power struggle that was going on in Europe. more or less, he managed to avoid it, which was a good thing because it was a horrible, horrible war. There was something called the Spanish Match, which was going to be a marriage between James's son Charles and the younger daughter of the King of Spain, Maria Anna. Well, for several years this was going on, this plan, and Spain and England are being friendly because the young prince is going to marry the young princess, and it's all kind of friendly and it looks good. But it went on for a long, long time. And part of the problem was that the English government, the Parliament, wanted Charles to marry a Protestant, of course. They didn't want Charles to be marrying a Catholic. And of course, the Queen, the Princess of Spain was Catholic. Spain was a Catholic country. So Charles said, okay, mo takusan, I'm tired of the politicians telling me who I can marry and who I can't marry. And it's been going on for a long, long time. I'm going to go to Spain. I'm going to meet her. I'm going to present myself to her. And so he did. Well, he didn't say, I'm your knight in shining armor, baby. I mean, that's just me fooling around. But you know, he went off to Spain and he presented himself to her, and she hated him. That was the end of that. Okay, as soon as she saw him, no, thank you. She didn't want him. All right, very clear about it. So that was the end of the Spanish Match. She just wasn't interested. So James's son never did marry the princess from Spain. Now, the complicated fighting that was going on in Europe at this time was something called the 30 Years' War, a very nasty situation, the 30 Years' War. And in one way, James was lucky with his daughter. I mean, he was able to get her married to the person that he wanted her to marry, who was not a king, but an elector palatine. Germany was not one country in those days. It was divided up into lots of complicated smaller countries. And the Palatine was a ruler of a small part of what is now Germany. And Frederick was the Elector Palatine. He was lower than a prince or king at the time that he married James's daughter. But later on, he also became king of Bohemia. And this is where the problems begin. Shortly after becoming a king of Bohemia, Frederick gets into a fight with the Holy Roman Emperor. That's not the same as the Pope. The Roman Empire had come to an end as such, but in Europe there has still been a kind of shadow Holy Roman Empire. It's complicated. I'm not teaching European history, so I'm not going to go into details. And anyway, I couldn't. I don't really understand all that history myself. It's pretty complicated. But the power balance in Europe was quite complicated. You had these smaller kingdoms, but they depended on a sort of federation of kingdoms that had joined together. And the Holy Roman Emperor was a sort of uniting or joining together these different smaller kingdoms, but exactly the balance of power was often debated, and not just debated in words, but debated in swords and guns and fighting. So they would, who's really in control here? And a nasty fight broke out in the early part of the 17th century. As a result of it, Frederick lost his crown. He was only the king of Bohemia for a fairly short time, and he wanted James to support him, and James said, no, thank you, I'm not interested. It's too complicated and it's too difficult, and good luck, but I'm not joining in. And to be honest, that was probably the best thing to do, because the 30 Years' War was very bloody, very horrible, and nobody won, and nobody, well, everybody lost, because thousands and thousands of people were killed in a very nasty war, and nobody won anything out of it. So this quarrel between Frederick, the husband of James's daughter, and the Holy Roman Emperor Ferdinand was the beginning of this very nasty war, and James managed to keep England out of that war, at least as long as James was alive. It's worth noticing that when the Stuart line died out, finally in the early 18th century, when just as Elizabeth died with no children, the last of the Stuarts died with no children, and then the throne of England went to the descendants of Elizabeth and Frederick through their daughter Sophia of Hanover, and that's the line that we've still got today in the throne, in the royal family in Britain. So just as when Henry VII's daughter married the King of Scotland, the throne went to the Scottish king, so in the end the English throne went to a German king in the 18th century. So these family connections could end up, and in both cases they were very important. England had a Scottish king and England had a German king. In fact, even today, the royal family is basically of Germanic origin. So yes, for 30 years war. I'm showing a picture of skulls and cross sort of riders of death, really, death riders, because it was a very bloody and horrible time in Europe, and James managed to keep England out of it. What about the New World, America, the Caribbean, that had been opening up? Remember, in 1492, Columbus had discovered America, and the Spanish and the Portuguese had been going to America in large numbers, and on their way back with their ships full of gold and things from the Aztecs, the English pirates would attack them and take their treasure at the last minute. This is one of the things that led to the Spanish Armada and the war with Spain, these English pirates stealing the Spanish treasure. But what about the English themselves? Were they going out to the New World? I think last week I said they were, didn't I? Before the colony of Jamestown, there'd been other colonies in Virginia that had not succeeded. But the first successful colony was actually called Jamestown after James I, and it was established in 1609. That first year, that first winter, they nearly died out. Most, something like 60 out of 300, well, 80% of them, is it, were wiped out during that first winter. But somehow they managed to survive, and basically they grew tobacco, which they exported back to England, and tobacco was growing in importance and popularity, so that by 1614 there were 7,000 tobacco houses in London. So the people in Jamestown had plenty of customers back there in England. They could just pack a ship full of tobacco and it would be smoked pretty quickly when it got to England. And then a few years later, the first slaves started arriving from Africa. They were taken to Jamestown to cultivate tobacco, and the slave triangle begins at this time. How does this slave triangle work? I think I've got something on this a little bit later on, but just very simple explanation for now. They take cheap goods to Africa and they buy slaves. They take the slaves to the New World and they exchange the slaves for tobacco and other expensive products, which then go back to England. And so they set off with a very cheap load of goods and they come back with very, very expensive goods. So that one trip could make somebody's fortune. If you know your Disney, you'll probably have heard of Pocahontas. The founder of Jamestown was a man called John Rolfe, and he's famous for his marriage to the daughter of a Native American chief, Pocahontas, who herself visited London, and we romanticize that marriage and that relationship. But you've probably heard of Pocahontas. Kita koto aru desho? Yeah. Okay, so something you recognize, something you know. And here it is. By the end of the 17th century, it was looking something like this. Still a fairly small community, but looking almost like an English village, you know. Not so different in a way. And it's got its port and so on. So it was a small town. Eventually it was abandoned. It was on swampy ground. It would get muddy in the rain, and it wasn't a good place to build a town, to be honest. So they abandoned it later and moved somewhere else. But by the time Jamestown ended as a colony, there were other colonies around the place, and the English were spreading through North America. But Jamestown was the first. Also relating at this time to America and the English presence in America, we've got the Pilgrim Fathers. You may have heard about them as well, a little bit, I don't know. There was a group of people, and again, like a lot of the things from this time, it goes back to religion. There was a group of people who were called Brownists because they followed a man called Robert Brown. Well, who was Robert Brown and what was he saying? Well, he wanted the church to be organized in a way that each individual church was independent. That's called congregationalism. Each church is independent. It's not a pyramid structure, all right, with control coming from the bishops and coming downwards. It's not that kind of structure. It's an equal structure. Each church is its own independent unit and makes its own decisions, and there's no overall structure. So each congregation, each group of people say, well, we in this town, in this village, we believe in God in our way, and in our church we do it our way, and it's nobody else's business. Okay, we don't want somebody higher up in the church telling us what we have to do. We just want to do it in our own way. So they were called Brownists, kind of church anarchy, really. They didn't want any power structure inside the church. And Brown himself changed his way of thinking and joined the Eikoku Kyokai, accepted the Church of England. But the way of thinking, the Congregationalist way of thinking, continued to be called Brownist. And the Pilgrim Fathers, or many of them, were Brownists. They wanted the freedom to have their own church without somebody else from higher up coming and saying, you have to do it like this, you have to do it like this. So they got a ship and they sailed away to America. And the name of the ship was? What's the name of that ship? That's right, it was the Mayflower, all right? It's very, very famous. The Pilgrim Fathers who came on the Mayflower were, they're kind of considered to be almost like the original Americans. As we've seen, there were a few white people there before the Mayflower sailed, but that's seen as almost like the beginning of American culture, the beginning of American society, starting with the Mayflower. So it sailed off in 1620. These radical Puritans were in danger. In England, they were running the risk of having their tongue cut out or their ears chopped off. In Europe, they were being put to death in large numbers. These radical Puritans, radical Protestants were considered dangerous to society because they didn't want social control. They didn't want anybody else telling them what to do. It's my God, I'll do as I please. But religion and politics had been connected so closely for so long that people saying such a thing were considered to be very dangerous. And across Europe, many of them were put to death. So they were escaping from a politically oppressive situation. They wanted to make their own churches, and they weren't allowed to do that in England, and in most of Europe also, they were not being given that kind of freedom, so they decided to go to America. They're called the Pilgrim Fathers, and they're often considered to be the kind of founders of modern America. Are we okay? And now, this whole question of James being king by divine right because God chose him to be king, and how that affects the Parliament and the government at the time. Starting off with money. He had money problems right from the beginning. The Elizabethan period had a modest debt, £350,000. If you think that right now £1 equals about 150 yen, so if it's £350,000, that would make 475. I don't know how many zeros to add now. I think it's is that right? Have I got it right? No, it's more. It's no. Huh? One more. Is it? Thank you. Okay, so it's not a huge amount of money, is it? Really, like 500万yen gurai. Is that right? So it's not a huge amount of money, but in those days, that would be a lot of money. Have I got it right? Just a minute, 350,000. No, just a minute. Go ahead. Huh? Sorry? Do I need another zero? And how much have we got? So that's just a minute. That's 100万. We got. So 4億 Goku. Yeah, sorry, it's yeah, that's okay. Yeah, that well, whatever the heck it is, it's not a huge amount of money. Okay, I'm not sure actually. I think I might have 1 0 too many. But anyway, the point is, it's not a big amount of money for us today, but in those days it was a lot of money. 52. Right. Okay. Yeah, we had it. You got it at today's exchange rate. It would be. It is. Okay, we were wrong about that extra 0. Okay. Okay, sorry. Well, oh God, I'm still getting it. 52, 5. All right, we got it there now. 52,500,000 yen. Okay, so that's yeah, that's about half of 1 oku. It's not that much money by today's money, but if you look at what you could buy in those days, 1 penny was divided into 4 parts. Okay, 1 penny today would be nothing. Okay, so what could you buy with that money? You could probably buy several of those ships, for example. You might be able to buy several of those big ships that sailed across, like the Mayflower. I don't know how much a ship like the Mayflower would have cost, but it would be a lot. It would be less than that amount of money. Okay. We're still not sure about the sums of money involved.
How much was
£1 about 150 at that time there weren't yen. They were using sen, weren't they, or something? I don't know. It is a bit difficult to make comparisons with prices from those days. Probably a pair of shoes would be costing something like 10, 15 yen. Okay, something like that. So prices compared to today are completely different. You can't really compare today's prices. What I want to say that we need to notice is that when James came in, it went up like sanbai gurai very quickly. That's the point. Okay, it went up from 350,000 to 1,400. It just went up hugely. 3 倍以上, 4倍ぐらい. Okay, why? Because this king of Scotland had come along, and Scotland was a kind of a cold country where people ate, sheep's meat, mutton was common. You couldn't grow mugi, so they had rai mugi and oto mugi. He arrives in England, it's like, oh, these people live in luxury. Let's have a party. So he blew a lot of money on having, parties, having fun, having a rich life. Scotland was a poor country. Suddenly finding himself the king of a reasonably rich country, he spent a lot of money. Right, so the national debt went up something like 3 to 4 times in his first 5 years as king. So money was a problem. And a lot of his quarrels with Parliament were about money. Another problem was religion, and the other was kind of kenpo no yona thing, sort of constitutional matters. And basically, because he considered that he was king because God wanted him to be king, because of his idea of, this divine right, he would just shut Parliament down. He'd just say, if you don't agree with me, you can all go home. I'll do it by myself. Now, Elizabeth cooperated with her advisors. So this was going to be a problem. The English people, by now, the politicians, were used to a situation where the Queen was cooperating with them. Now they've got a king who's not cooperating. He just says, go home. So this is going to cause problems. And by the end of his reign, there's going to be a severe economic problem. The country's going to be in depression. So things are not smooth at home. In fact, just to make things even worse, there was an outbreak of pestle, plague, at the end of the period of James's reign, and that killed about 100,000 people. 100,000 people, okay, Jumangni. The population of England at this time was about Nihyakumangni. So it's quite a large part of the population of the country. And these disagreements with the Parliament became a bigger problem with James's son Charles. Things got worse, and in the middle of the century we're going to see the Civil War, and we're going to see the king having his head chopped off, because there's going to be a Puritan Kakume, the Puritan Revolution, and it's going to lead to the death of James's son. But the problems begin with James, who has this idea that he doesn't need to listen to the politicians. And his son grows up with the same idea. I'm king because God has chosen me. I don't need to listen to these people. And then those people say, you don't want to listen to us? Well, we're going to fight you. And we're going to chop your head off. And that's what happens.